Hallo. Is it on? Yes. Good evening. Hello. If the space is full here, there's also like a projection outside. There's a limited number of seatings here. So please take your seats so we can get started. Okay, so welcome. I'm your program chair, which has been a privilege. Luc Gerhard from University of Leuven in Belgium and Örebro University in Sweden. I'm very excited about IJCAI this year, and I'm also very excited about announcing our first invited speaker, Gerhard Widmer, who is an authority in the field of AI and music, and that's really a fitting theme for the city of Vienna. I mean, Vienna has a rich tradition in the arts. You see it in this building, you see it in the city. And if you talk about AI and arts, we had a special track, and then there is no better person to invite than Gerhard, because he's been pioneering since the 80s the field of AI and music. He's been awarded many distinctions. He's got the Wittgenstein Award from Austria, which is the highest scientific distinction. He's got 2 ERCs. He just got the Scientific Breakthrough of the Year from the Falling Walls. And so we're privileged that he took the time and with his team to come here and talk about music expressivity. He's also going to talk about a kind of Turing test, but he's not so much a fan of that, I understand. And yeah, please welcome Gerhard.
Thank you very much, Luc. Can you hear me? Yes, it's on. Thank you very much, Luc. Thanks for these very kind words. How do you know that I'm not so much a fan of the Turing test?
Well, you said it in your abstract.
Okay. Well, I'll say something to this effect, I guess. Yes. Okay. Thanks a lot. Thanks so much for inviting me to this to give a presentation here at this very special occasion and very special conference. It's fantastic to be back to an IJCAI and an ECAI conference in Vienna, the city where I live, and to give a presentation here. And thanks to all of you for joining us here while you're waiting for the opening reception, or some of you have already started, I think. You will be treated to a live demo here if everything works well, and you will also get to try some things on this grand piano yourselves if you want afterwards during the reception, if you're interested. So, AI and music. Yeah, I've been working in this field for a long time, and 30 years ago I would have had to justify in front of a general AI audience why music should be a worthwhile research topic for AI, but this has changed in a big way, I think. AI and music has become a serious research field, and I've had the good luck of being involved in it from the early days. And in fact, one of the presentations I could have given would have had a title like this, and would have given an overview of where the field comes from and where it's going and maybe where it should be going, and it would have involved references to some early meetings of the then still very small AI and music community in the 1990s. For instance, I was involved in organizing some of the early AI and music workshops, for example, at the IJCAI 95 conference in Montreal, and even earlier at ECAI 92, which took place in Vienna exactly 30 years ago. So the things we were doing in those days were really rather simple, and it's only later, after the year 2000, that the field of AI and music really took off in a big way, also with the emergence of a field called music information retrieval, or MIR. And there has been amazing progress on what machines can do with music, and specifically with audio, you know, from rhythm detection to song identification and cover song detection and music arrangement and style transfer. And there's a lot of interest in this from the music industry. In fact, I could have given a full presentation just on commercial applications of AI in the field, in the digital music field, from music streaming and music recommenders to smart playing devices and music production, video production, and media monitoring. Also many things that my own research groups were involved in, including patents and all. But this topic wouldn't have been very inspiring to me. I mean, there's a lot of great work going on out there, but much of it takes a kind of engineering approach, you know, with a lot of data and huge, deep networks that are transferred to music from fields like computer vision and language processing. And much of it just views music as data, as another kind of signal. And as someone who's really serious about music, I feel that some of that work is a bit, let's say, simplistic, musically speaking, and doesn't do justice to music as an art form, as what it is. And I'm known to have published a kind of manifesto about this a few years ago, about a lot of MIR work research not getting at the essence of what music is as a human art. So, which is why what I'd like to talk about today and what I'd like to share with you is a scenario where I think AI can be useful, and at the same time we can get a bit closer to the essence of music as a human art and as a means of communication. And I'd like to show you how we can use AI and machine learning to ask a few questions about how music works and how we can also maybe support human music making. Maybe I should clarify this from the start. So this is not going to be about any new AI methods. I'll just try to show how we can use AI methods to learn a bit about what might seem to be a rather intangible phenomenon from the start. And also another word of warning, this is going to be mostly about classical music, which is closest, the dearest to my heart, the older I get. But this is also, I mean, much of this also applies to other kinds of music. Anyway, so let's get to the music. We have this special computer grand piano here. So let's play some music on it from the 19th century, a Nocturne by Frédéric Chopin. I'm sure many of you know this piece, so just sit back and listen. That's bad, isn't it? That was bad, right? That was enough. That was terrible. And there was something wrong, and of course you know what the problem was. I mean, this was a straight, mechanical, unexpressive rendition of the score, everything with perfectly equal loudness, perfectly constant tempo, just the notes as they appear in the score. And now here we have, for contrast, how a human pianist played the same passage on one particular evening in May 1989. was very different, wasn't it? This was living, breathing music. So music, of course, is so much more than what's written in the score. Music needs the art of the human performer to make it come alive and to make it become expressive and to communicate emotions and moods and so on. And as you know, performers do this by adding very, very subtle nuances that go beyond what is prescribed in the score. And we call this art expressive performance. And this is really at the very heart of what music is about, because this is why we go to concerts, to listen to the same pieces over and over again, because the possibilities are endless. Or to put it in the words of Carl Seashore, one of the pioneers of performance research, the unlimited resources for vocal and instrumental art lie in artistic deviation from the pure, the perfect, the exact, the rigid, the even, and the precise. And we have here an example of these artistic deviations from the rigid and the precise. These are tempo and loudness fluctuations that were applied by a pianist over a few bars of Chopin. So a perfectly unexpressive mechanical rendition will give you two straight lines, right? Flat, perfectly constant tempo, perfectly constant loudness. So you see there's a lot going on here. And if you think this is random, here we have 4 pianists, and here we have 10 and 22. Now, they all come from the same school, admittedly. Vienna, the University of Music. But so you see there are very strong commonalities, but there are also lots of differences, and as we'll see, both of these are significant. And in fact, how this works, how performers evoke and communicate emotions through their playing, and how we as listeners pick this up and decode this. These are big questions in the cognitive sciences of music. And what we as AI scientists want to do is we want to look at some of these questions with data-driven methods and computational models. And we've been doing this for many years now, and most recently in a large 6-year project by the name of Con Espressione. This is the project webpage. You can easily find it on the web. So this project was about, computational models of expressivity, expressive aspects in music. And music can express many things, of course. It can express basic emotions, happiness, sadness, fear, but also more general things like determination or uncertainty or playfulness or even humor. This is what makes music such a rich and gratifying art. And this is both a function of the music, the way it's written, and of performance, the way it's played. And the focus of our research is on the contribution of performance, on the art of performance as a way of communicating affect and emotion and expressivity. The motivation for this is really twofold. Theoretical, we want to learn a bit about how this works, and of course practical. In the end, we want technologies that can recognize and respond to expressive aspects in music. Or to rephrase a sentence from the abstract, our goal was to build systems that can recognize, characterize, generate, modify, and react to expressive qualities in music. Which translates into a number of different research directions. The first one I'm listing here is related to real-time listening, to real-time following, tracking of a performance. The idea is to the task of being able to listen to a live performance and being able to read along in the score and always know exactly where the musicians are in the piece, regardless of how they're playing. This is called score following generally. It's a rather technical task. It's challenging, but it's maybe not so deep, musically speaking. But it's important for many applications and also for the demo later, so I will say a few words about it. The second question then is about perception, decoding. What do we perceive? What do we perceive in performances? And can we build computational models of that? 3 is about playing, expressive playing. Can machines learn to play music expressively themselves? And 4 relates to the final goal of our project, namely to build systems that can interact with music and musicians in natural and expressivity-aware ways. So let me just briefly start with the first topic, just a few words, I'll keep it short. Score following. We've been doing a lot of work on systems that can reliably track performances, live performances in real time, in very robust ways and for very complex music. And our most spectacular success, if I may say so, is something we presented at an IJCAI conference a couple of years ago, named a system that successfully tracked a full orchestra concert live in the Concertgebouw Concert Hall in Amsterdam with the Royal Concertgebouw Orchestra and Maris Janssons. And the system was just a laptop listening to the live concert, to the audio signal through a microphone and trying to follow along in the full score. And it used that to send score information to the audience in real time, perfectly synchronized to the performance. Let me just show you a very short video from that event, just so you know what this is about. And it will be louder in a second. Okay, so what's behind this technically is an ensemble of tracking agents that are using things like online dynamic time warping or probabilistic models in order to do real-time audio to score, audio to audio alignment, and on top of that we have an adaptive predictive tempo model that coordinates these agents. Actually, we also looked at reinforcement learning solutions to this, which is also an interesting idea. So we know how to deal with real-time performance tracking reasonably well, and this will serve us later, but let's move to questions that are more closely related to the issue of expressivity. So the first question is about decoding. What do we perceive? What expressive aspects do we perceive in performances, and how do we manage to understand or to recognize what performers wish to express through their playing? And that relates to the differences between different performers, because the same piece of music can express quite different things depending on how it is played. And in order to demonstrate that, I would like to do a little test with you. I have here, with very simple music, Mozart, so-called Sonata Facile, beginning of the second movement. I have here 5 recordings by 5 different pianists, and I will switch between them. And you'll have to listen very closely and very carefully, but you will hear that they sound different. Or not just sound, but they have a different character because they're being played in a different way. And while you're listening, please try to think of words, try to think of adjectives with which you would describe these performances. Let's start with pianist number 1. Here's number 2. Number 3. Number 4. Here's number 3 again. Don't look at me, just listen. Here's number 2. We haven't heard number 5 yet. Here's number 5. Okay, I think this is enough. I think you got the idea, and I'm sure you heard the differences, and I'm sure you would agree that these performances, even though they relate to the same piece, they sound really different. So did you think of words? I'm sure you did, but maybe in the interest of time, let me suggest some words that I came up with, and you can compare that to your notes. So number 1, I would call boring, bland. Number 2 was more singing and poetical, or maybe if you had heard a bit more, you would agree with me. Number 3 was more calm and serious and earnest. Number 4, by contrast, was more on the light side, more playful, also with these ornaments. And number 5, to me, was just hyperactive. Hyperactive, or actually, To me, this is an absurd way of playing Mozart. Okay, so for the curious among you here, the pianists behind these recordings, number one was not a performance at all. It was just a straight rendering of the score, unexpressive. Number two was Maria João Pires. Number three was Mitsuko Uchida. Number four was Friedrich Gulda. Number five, I'm sure you have some suggestion. Anyone? Glenn Gould, yes, of course, Glenn Gould. Five was Glenn Gould. So these are very subtle effects and very subtle differences, but we do perceive them, and they make a difference to us, musically and emotionally. And so the question is, can we build computational models that can recognize such subtle differences and then can possibly name them, and maybe even explain them? And this would be of interest not only for theoretical reasons, but also might be useful for many practical applications. Think, search engine, music search engines, recommender systems, and the like. So we'll frame this as a machine learning problem. But maybe first we should think about whether there's anything to learn at all, and look into the literature. So is this a systematic phenomenon at all? Is there any hope that we can learn anything? And in fact, the music psychology tells us there is, to a certain extent. Psychologists have shown in very controlled experiments that musicians can communicate intended emotional expression with pretty high accuracy, and listeners quite reliably can pick this up. And we even know that there seem to be specific processes in the brain related to musical emotion decoding. So all in all, music and music performance seem to be an effective communication channel. And so there have got to be common common conceptions that we should be able to learn and discover. But what these are, for this we need data. So we need to, what expressive qualities do human listeners perceive in performances, and how would they, dimensions do they distinguish? How would they describe them? In order to collect data, we set up this web-based crowdsourcing thing called the Conespressione game. So we selected excerpts from 9 classical solo piano pieces recorded by many different famous pianists for a total of 45 musical examples. And then we asked people out there in the world to listen and describe the character of these performances with freely chosen words. Just exactly what I did with you just now. And over a period of 2 years, we collected quite a lot of data in this way, more than 1,500 characterizations of performances, more than 1,400 unique words that appeared in there. So that gives us a big data matrix, a piece by performance by verbal characterization matrix, and by statistical analysis of this word occurrence matrix, you can try to derive the main underlying dimensions along which these terms seem to be organized, which would give us some kind of semantic expression description space, right? I'm showing here just 2 dimensions that came out of the Conespressione game data, and the most important one, the major one, the horizontal, is that people seem to differentiate performances along a continuum from words like gentle, tender, calm on one end of the spectrum to words like hectic, agitated, and harsh on the other. This is a dimension I think you could easily find a name for. Overall, we found 4 significant dimensions in the Conespressione data. Not all of them are as directly interpretable as the first one, but as continuous dimensions, they now give us regression targets for predictive machine learning. So now we have finally the machine learning scenario. We want to learn models that can predict perceived expressive qualities from audio recordings by listening. And we don't just want black box models that somehow map some signal combinations to our targets. We want explanations of some sort. We want to understand what are the cues or the musical properties of a performance that seem to communicate certain expressive qualities. And these would have to be things that everybody can more or less directly perceive without musical training, because otherwise most people would not recognize the differences in expressivity in performances, which we know people do. So the literature on speech and music perception has this notion of mid-level perceptual features, which would be very general qualities that we can assume most people to directly and intuitively perceive, regardless of their level of training. And it has been suggested that these would act as mediators in the perception of more complex and more abstract percepts, such as expressive character. And here's one particular set of mid-level features that was recently proposed for the domain of music. It includes qualities such as melodiousness, right? How melodious something sounds to a listener. Or articulation, how articulated or flowing a passage feels. Or perceived stability and complexity of the rhythm. Very general things. And this feature set comes with an annotated corpus of 5,000 music recordings that were annotated along these lines by hundreds of musical listeners. So with that data, we can now look at multi-level prediction approaches. For example, in the simplest case, learn models that predict these mid-level qualities from audio, and then learn models that learn to predict perceived expressive character from these mid-level concepts, maybe even via very simple or maybe even linear models, so that you get easily interpretable explanations in terms of such mid-level concepts. This is all very straightforward from a machine learning point of view, except that we ran into another practical problem, which is called domain mismatch in machine learning. Eventually, we want to predict both mid-level and expressive character on classical solo piano music, which is very, very subtle stuff. But the training data, the only training set that's available for learning mid-level prediction models, consists of very different stuff, namely mostly rock, pop, and film music. So machine learning people would call this a distribution mismatch, which forced us to set up a complex unsupervised domain adaptation process to transfer the mid-level models we learned from rock and pop music to the world of classical solo piano without labeled target data. Never mind how this works, this is machine learning magic. The interesting thing is that we could show that through this adaptation step, the set of mid-level features that become directly predictive of perceived expressivity grows. So we are moving towards a small set of common general concepts that seem to be predictive and possibly also be of explanatory value for this prediction task. Now, okay, here they are in action in a prediction task, on the task of emotion prediction in particular. So we have here two pieces, two preludes from Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, as played and recorded by 6 famous pianists. And these were annotated by the human listeners in terms of the emotion they perceive in these performances. So we have in two pieces, in each piece 6 pianists, 6 recordings. What you see here are the averaged listener ratings of perceived emotion. And in both cases we have a clear outlier, Glenn Gould in one case, Friedrich Gulda in the other. And one thing we did is we trained a number of different alternative machine learning models on the task of emotion prediction in performance, using different sets of audio features that we extract from the audio. And it turns out that when you ask these models then to predict the perceived emotion specifically on these outliers, it turns out that the model that most precisely and consistently, not only over these two, but over the whole set, predicts the outliers is the model that makes its prediction based on these mid-level concepts, which gives us another indication that we're moving, that these concepts seem to have explanatory potential. Now this model was trained on Bach, but of course we can also ask it what it thinks of the Mozart recordings that you listened to. So here's how it would predict perceived emotion in these 5 Mozart recordings. Well, maybe you're not familiar with the dimension of valence and arousal with which we describe emotion, and this is Russell's circumplex model of emotion. Some of you may know it, some of you don't. Valence is about sort of positive versus negative emotions, and arousal is about arousal potential. But if you want verbal characterization, we can map general emotion terms into this valence arousal space. This is based on Russell's original work. And from this we would see that our model would place Uchida number 3, the pianist that we thought was a bit more on the serious side, would place her slightly closer on the, maybe slightly a bit more to the calm side of things. It would place the inexpressive MIDI performance closer to the neutral origin. And surprisingly to me, it would characterize this hyperactive Gould performance number 5 as delighted and happy, which is not how I would describe it, but on going back to the Conespressione game data, it turns out that some people actually use such positive terms for the Gould performance. And maybe some of you also perceived it in those terms. I don't know. I think it's maybe a matter also of musical background. Anyway, last step, when we now when we now feed all 45 examples from the full Conespressione game, all the 45 examples to this emotion prediction model, which was trained on Bach, we get these predictions. Different colors are different pieces, compositions, and dots of the same color are different performances of the same piece. So you see there's both a piece effect, so performances of the same piece tend to sort of cluster together. Well, obviously, because a piece has a certain intrinsic kind of character, right? You cannot play Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which is the green dots in the lower left. You couldn't reasonably play this piece in a happy or in an aggressive way. But there's also clear effects of performance, and for instance, especially the performances of the, can you see the mouse? The performances of the Liszt piece are quite spread out in expression space, and you really hear the difference in character when you listen to the performance. And then there's this orange dot in the upper right, which when I saw this, it reminded me of something I had written in the year 2014 when I wrote the project proposal for this project, where I was already thinking about such expressivity description spaces and machines that would recognize expressivity in performance. And so I went back to the proposal and I was pleased to find this passage in there. Well, nice, right? There we have it. This is Glenn Gould's Mozart, the orange dot. I mean, it's nice. It's not terribly significant, but it's nice to see. Right, so much for perception, the perception of expressive aspects. But what about playing? What about performance? Can machines learn to play music expressively, under quotes, themselves, by learning from human performances? So again, this is going to be a machine learning problem, and again, it might help to first think about whether there is anything that could be learned or what this might be. So here the question would be, to what extent is expressive performance predictable? Can we predict how a piece will be played by just looking at the score? Are there fundamental common principles that would support a predictive model even across different performers? Well, musicologists have shown in very detailed studies that there are strong underlying, at some level, commonalities between performances of the same piece by very different famous pianists. So much so that even the grand average of these performances still makes some musical sense, sometimes. And of course, we also see this in our data. You remember our Chopin curves with these strong common trends. And there's a reason for this. It's because one function of expressive performance is to signal the structure of the music to the listeners, to make the listener understand how a piece is composed of, themes and phrases and sections at different levels, and musicians have a certain way of bringing out the structure of the piece of the music through their expressive playing. In fact, this effect is so strong that it has been shown that trained musicians, trained pianists cannot play strictly mechanically, even when they are told to do so. They inadvertently and subconsciously still play a little bit expressively, such that the structure of the music still shines through. So all in all, that means there have got to be common underlying principles that should be learnable by a machine, and they would have to relate to structural aspects of the score. So now, again, machine learning scenario. Given an arbitrary score of an arbitrary piece, learn to predict how this piece should or will be played in terms of expressive parameters such as expressive timing and dynamics and articulation and whatever else a pianist can do, which I have indicated here by these curves on the right-hand side. And again, the first problem is a data problem. You need a lot of training examples, training data. In this case, a lot of pieces in terms of score, how the music is written, and in terms of performance, how it's actually played. And we need note-precise measurements of how each individual note was played by a pianist, when, how long, how loud, because piano performance is an extremely subtle art. And this is something that, unfortunately, we cannot measure from audio recordings at this level of precision. You just have to take my word for it. So we cannot just go out there, and collect all the recordings of all the great pianists as training material. The only way to get such note-precise measurements is via special instruments, such as this computer grand piano here, which measures every detail of your playing and every key and every pedal movement precisely. But of course, obtaining such data from really high-class pianists is difficult. But we were lucky, actually. This brings me to our Magalov story, which is amazing, a beautiful story, how we by chance obtained a unique and incredible collection of measurements of a world-class pianist who had recorded, unbeknownst to the world, recorded the complete solo piano works by Frédéric Chopin on such a computer grand piano in the 1980s, shortly before his death. And I stumbled upon the data by chance in the Bösendorfer piano factory in Vienna. It was just lying around there. They didn't even know they had it. And it took me quite some time then to find his widow and get her written permission to use this data for scientific purposes. And then it took us a full 2 years to prepare the data for detailed analysis. But the result is a corpus of more than 300,000 played notes, each one precisely aligned to the corresponding score, and each one precisely measured and documented. So this is the Magalov corpus, a unique resource and a unique opportunity to look into the art of a great pianist. And by the way, the pianist that you heard at the beginning, the second rendition of this nocturne, that was Magalov as he played this piece in 1989. Right, so back to the machine learning scenario now with lots of real-world data to experiment with, and the experimentation space is huge. I mean, for one thing, there's the model class question, right? Such a predictive model will be a mapping from scores to expressive playing patterns, and this could be any function. It could be a linear mapping, which would likely be too simple, but it might be nice in terms of interpretability, or it could be a more complex multi-level nonlinear function, something like this, which is generally known as a deep neural network. And then there's deep network architectures of many different kinds, feed-forward and recurrent and bidirectional and attention-based and so on. So that already gives us a lot of degrees of freedom in experimentation. But again, the more interesting aspects are the musical questions that we can ask here, which we can address by choosing how to encode the inputs and the expressive outputs. On the input side, clearly we need a machine-readable representation of the score in terms of some features or descriptors that describe individual notes and their connections and so on. And by choosing what we include in this representation in terms of more or less abstract structural properties of the music, we can do targeted investigations into different hypotheses regarding the connection between musical structure and performance. And likewise, on the output side, we can encode the expressive targets in different ways in a different musical abstraction and different temporal abstraction levels. And in this way, again, explore different hypotheses on how we shape music and how we shape musical time. So this is a huge space of possibilities, and each combination will give us different models that predict expressive performances from a given score. Which, of course, now immediately leads to the evaluation problem. How do you evaluate such a model? How do you evaluate computer-generated performance when there is no definite ground truth, when there is no one way of playing a piece correctly? Of course, you can compare performance curves predicted by a model to performance curves of real pianists, and you can measure things like correlation and mean and absolute errors and the like. But what you measure in this way is only similarity to one particular artist. And what is worse, different errors or deviations might be of different level of severity, musically speaking. So some deviations might be totally okay, meaningful. Some might actually sound totally absurd when you listen to them. And this is still a completely open and unsolved problem in our research community, how to define anything like a meaningful standard of comparison for automatic evaluation. But even with such limited quantitative measures, you can still do useful things. For instance, when you want to automatically compare many alternative models, say, for example, when you want to find out which out of a large set of different feature sets best explains or reconstructs the data that you have. And in this way, we have done quite a number of targeted machine learning studies on the possible role of such musical aspects as tonal tension, or musical expectation and surprise, or temporal dependencies. I'm not going to go into musical details, it would take me too long even to explain tonal tension. But what I'm trying to say is, in this way, and using quantitative measures, and you can set up targeted machine learning experiments with which you can try to verify or support various musicological hypotheses. But the ultimate test, when it comes to evaluating the musical quality of a machine-generated performance, the ultimate and only test is listening. And I brought one listening example here for you, the one that I always show to audiences. This is the best one we ever got. This gives you an impression of just how good it can get. Okay? Keep that in mind. And this again relates to, the same piece as before, the Nocturne from the beginning. You remember how terrible it sounded when it was played in a mechanical, unexpressive way. Now this is how one of our models now will play it after it was trained on other pieces. And I will just play an audio recording quickly, and please listen and focus on the tempo dimensions, on the timing, how naturally it flows. And these red lines below the score, they plot the inverse of tempo. So speeding up, slowing down. All right, let's see. So on. I think that sounded much better than we heard at the beginning, right? And you could clearly hear, and you can also see it in these inverse tempo plots. The model seems to have learned a kind of expressive phrasing strategy with nice slowing down towards phrase endings at multiple levels. So this starts to sound like real music. You might even think it could have been played by a human. And it so happened that colleagues of ours from Australia and Italy set up and published something they called a musical Turing test, a blind listening test where they confronted a large panel of human listeners, 170 human listeners, with multiple recordings of the same piece, all played and recorded on the same piano, 4 of them by computer performance models, one from Italy, one from Sweden, one from Japan, and ours, our so-called basis function model. And they also included a performance by what they write was a world-renowned concert pianist, also recorded on the same piano. And to make it short, here's the main result of their paper. These are the mean ratings of the listening jury to the question, do you think this performance was played by a human? This is the human concert pianist, and this is our machine learning model. The differences are not statistically significant, but it seems like our model convinced the audience as much as a human pianist did. From which the authors drew this rather bold conclusion, if I may say so, which makes me a bit uneasy, not only because of this the way they relate this to the Deep Blue story. I mean, the Deep Blue story, that was really a milestone in the history of AI, wasn't it? And I think at this point we should really, really be careful and think about what this kind of test really means. First of all, there are reasons to be a bit skeptical about how the test was done, and I personally have certain reservations regarding the specific, very simple piece they chose and regarding the specific questions they asked. But even more generally, it's not clear what this kind of, it's not clear to me what a Turing test in the domain of the arts would measure. I mean, what does it mean when you present people with a complex artifact, like say a musical performance or a text or a painting, and ask them, do you think this was made by a human or by a machine? Even if I say a human performance, a machine-generated performance passes this kind of test, I mean, the system could have just learned one particular performance by heart, and you wouldn't be able to tell of just hearing it once. But it would play the piece the same way the next time and tomorrow and so on. What I'm trying to say is this kind of test, this test really shows is, or the only conclusion it supports, I think, is that the modeling assumptions we made in our machine learning project were good enough to result in an artifact, a machine-generated performance, that managed to fool a certain number of people once, at one occasion, and in a very artificial context. And I think this can in no way be taken as an indication that humans have reached the level of human musical artists, that machines have reached the level of human musical artists. I think this test just doesn't measure anything relevant in that respect. And besides, art is not about fooling people, is it? I mean, real art is more than just spitting out some artifacts at the push of a button. I mean, real art is about, and also the art of music performance is about having something to say and having an intention of wanting to say and share something. And I think all of this is way beyond current AI at the moment. So, which is why for one, I don't believe in AI systems as autonomous or expressive artists. You may want to argue with me about this, but I have a very strict position on this. I do believe that such kinds of models can be useful in the arts, but in more modest scenarios, maybe for instance, in interactive and collaborative scenarios with humans in the loop or humans in the lead. And this now brings, that's the last item on my list, and this now brings together all the previous things, following, decoding, and playing, now naturally come together in this last thing that we're going to show. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our ECAI. The ECAI is a computer system that accompanies a human pianist on the piano. For example, when you want to practice a piece for 2 pianists and you're alone, on your own. And of course, this accompanist shouldn't just play its part, in a strict way, so you have to adapt to it. It should be the other way around, that the computer listens to you and recognizes and adapts to your playing so that we get a natural cooperation. So this is the final demonstrator from the Con Espressione project, and we brought it here with you. And since I certainly wouldn't have the courage and the nerve and the skill to do this live here, I asked my colleague Carlos Cancino to play for you. The companion is his project, really. So, Carlos, please. And as you will see, he's also a wonderful, great pianist with nerves of steel. And while he's getting ready, let me just remind you briefly of what this system has to do. It has to listen to the pianist and try to synchronize itself with his playing and with the score. So this is about real-time score following. But it has to also make its own playing decision. It has to decide how to play its part. And that's based on a learned performance model. But it also has to recognize the pianist's expressive intentions, the way he wants to play, and adapt its playing style to that in real time. And most critically, all of this will have to be based on prediction, on anticipation, because reacting in this scenario, you're always too late. And not only because of the latency of the piano. So I think we're ready, and with this I'll leave the stage to you. Oh, I need to, you want to see something, right? You want to see him play. Let's see if this works now. We're now switching to this camera. Right. Okay. There you go. I told you, nerves of steel. So let's see if my presentation comes back. If it doesn't, it won't be a big problem either, but maybe it does. Yeah. We're getting close to the end. I should be getting close to the end. Well, actually, so I think I can make this short, really. I think I've made my point on this issue clearly enough. So I see the role of AI in music really as tools and assistants, and as tools for many things. For example, for generating musical material, maybe even in real time, for entertainment purposes, games and so on. for instance, interactive music making and creative exploration of ideas in interactive ways, maybe also as agents in new kinds of human-machine art forms. A lot of potential in music teaching, if done well. And one thing I'm personally interested in a lot is as AI methods as tools for studying serious musical questions. But if you want to do that, you need to be careful and really think about how to model musical phenomena in computational models. And that brings me to my very last slide, with which I would just like to point you to a big new project that we started just recently by the name of Widmer Music, which is exactly about that, about how to model musical phenomena such that you can answer serious musical questions. So you can look this up on the web and read this programmatic abstract there. Actually, I'm just showing this here as a cheap excuse for a final bit of shameless job advertising. And with this, I think I've used up my and your time, and I would like to thank you very much for your attention and your patience and hopefully your interest. Enjoy the reception, and we certainly look forward to seeing some of you here afterwards, because you'll be able to try these things yourselves if you want to. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gerhard, for this wonderful talk and this wonderful demonstration. Also, thanks, Carlos, for having steel nerves and a fabulous demonstration. We do have time for a couple of questions. I don't know who wants to. Virginia?
Thank you. It was a really great presentation, great everything. Just a small question, and I think probably is related to your new project. How are you considering the societal impact of this type of development? So,
Sorry, how am I considering?
The societal impact on society, on musicians, on performers, on fake music, deep fake music, or whatever kind of things like that. Are those issues that are part of your research?
Well, I would, if you ask about the societal impact of our work, then I would say, I mean, it would be immodest to say that we're having a real impact, a big impact on the world. We're trying to do, we're not. No. Okay, if you're asking in this specific way, are we considering, or would this be eventually lead to machines replacing music teachers or performers or whatever? No. No. I mean, if you're really into music and you know how complex music is and how complex it is to teach music, and what you, as a music teacher, that you don't just teach technique, right? You teach a mindset and a way of approaching this art. So we wouldn't, for a second, I wouldn't think for a second about in this direction. It's about tools for specific, maybe technical subtasks, tools to help you in practicing, tools that can give you very specific feedback on technical things while you're practicing, or that permit you, for instance, to compare your way, also in terms of interpretation, your way of playing a piece, comparing that to how other great pianists have played it. This could all be supported by machines, but of course, this is just a tiny part of teaching, and with respect to performance, I think we agree anyway, that we're very far from this.
So I think I have the first microphone. So this is not unrelated to the last question. A lot of your talk was couching musical performance and expressive performance in terms of emotion. And you may have noticed that there's been a lot bruited about in the public sphere recently about whether or not emotion recognition, whether it be facial emotion recognition or spoken emotion recognition, is either possible or allowable, which seem like incompatible objections. I guess my question is to move a little bit away from that question. If you had more information about the emotional state, if your companion performer had more information about the emotional state of the other performers that it was working with, do you think that its accompaniment would be more expressive and more appropriate? And is that an argument for things like sung emotion recognition or facial emotion recognition or gestural emotion recognition being continued as research areas?
Let me start with the second half of the question, whether this would be an argument for the ethical value, or whether emotion recognition should be allowed or not. No, if emotion recognition has severe, at that level of precision that you're insinuating, would have had severe dangers with it, coming with it, outside of it, maybe of the realm of piano playing, then any improvement in piano playing wouldn't justify doing this, right? I would definitely believe that if the companion had a more precise idea of your emotional state in the widest sense of the word, then that it would play much better. Because conversely, when you play with this thing, you will feel that it feels awful to play with this machine. It doesn't feel like playing with a human at all, right? You feel, when you play with this, you feel that this machine is not going to help you with errors, or it would not sense uncertainties on your part and then take the lead as a human would. Actually, it's a pretty stressful experience to play with this machine, especially in public demonstrations. But also, what I'm trying to say, what's completely missing is this, and what you have when you play with humans, is not just emotion recognition, but the sense of presence, the sense of togetherness, this sense that you can actually look at the person and feel when they breathe. And all that is needed for really good co-performance. So in that sense, yes, if the more information the companion had about your mental and emotional state, the better it could likely play, yes. Whether that would justify invasive brain measurements of your emotions, that's a different story.
Okay, let's take 3 more questions.
I have a question, but I'll just remark on the previous point. I think what you are trying to say is that the system is more like a sidekick and not a piano duet, where you go back and forth, and this guy goes crazy this way, then the other guy goes crazy this way, and then somehow they move together, whatever. Yeah. Right. I think that's what you were trying to say, right? I had a question, and so that was great work for classical music, but what about improvisational music, where there may be a kind of score, but the score is really rough. Right? So you can't really follow it very well. Even human listeners have difficulty following that kind of score, right?
So are we talking about automatically playing together,
improvisation,
joint improvisation?
I mean, like jazz, right? Like jazz, right?
Yeah,
And of course, all those same, in fact, the 4 points could still be done for jazz, but maybe it's just a much more difficult problem.
Yeah, this would introduce many, many new problems, obviously. It's about improvisation, it's about, first of all, even if you wanted to do something like score following, which is what jazz musicians do, you have to, of course, not follow on the basis of the surface, of the surface notes that you see, but you have to infer the harmonic underlying things. And that's what any jazz musician does. You hear the harmonies. So could be done. Joint improvisation, of course, opens huge new problems, because then it's not just about playing a pre-given thing, but your companion would also have to improvise, and it would have to improvise in a way that is somehow compatible with what you do. There is work on improvisation in AI. there has been work on systems that sort of try to respond to musical prompts that are played by a human and play back with some kind of fitting or suitable kind of response. Some of you may have seen, what was it called? The Continuator by François Pachet years ago. That was an attempt at building a system that doesn't sort of play directly together with you, but it responds. You play something and then it responds to by playing back in a hopefully similar style. But way too difficult for us.
So in danger of asking you to give another talk, but one of the items you had on your list was say, well, we could learn about music. So we could study musicological questions in this way. And you didn't really touch on that
Not
in your
very
material.
deeply.
So could you say a little bit about how these tools or this technology would help us to answer musicological questions?
You can look at very specific questions. I listed a number of papers. One of them was, for example, on tonal tension, right? There's the idea that performers might emphasize certain musical events in a piece depending on how tonally tense or relaxed they are. And there are sort of different definitions of what tonal tension is. What you can do is then design computational models of tonal tension, quantitative models that first of all estimate tonal tension at any point in the score, and then you can do machine learning experiments to see whether these features would actually help you in predicting performance better in certain passages. So very, very, very narrow, targeted kinds of things. And of these, we have many. But the big questions, why is music here? What does it do to us? We leave those questions to ourselves.
Hi, so great talk right in front of you. I'm Peter Stone from UT Austin and Sony AI, and really fantastic demonstrations. I'm curious about both in the nocturnes that you showed at the end with the tempo variations and in the live performance. It's very clear that it's reacting to the tempo. To what extent is it also following and reacting to dynamics and other musical features in the performance? Those were, at least on the surface, a little less obvious. I'm curious.
You don't perceive that as clearly as you perceive tempo. Generally, timing issues are much easier to pick up perceptually, and particularly with this loud piano, you didn't hear the nuances in dynamics. It does react to dynamics, which is not that hard. I mean, if you just want to react in a straight way, you can measure. You can watch the dynamics through the MIDI messages that are coming, so that's not a big issue. It also reacts to articulation, right? It changes articulatory aspects of playing in reaction to how you play, which are not really difficult. I mean, which are not really deep questions here. It's a matter of directly reacting and changing its articulation and loudness relative to what you're doing, but. Also predicting that from the score, because the score, of course, doesn't contain only notes. In scores, at least for the last 200 years, you have expression markings like crescendo signs and all that, and these are, I think, part of the score, and these are taken into account by the performance, the learned performance model. So these expression markings are part of the input features that prescribe the score.
Okay. Thanks. Hang on. Okay, thanks again, and Gerhard will be here for further discussions, and you can try it out. Maybe I should notice as well that the food is in both sides. You can go directly to the other room or to the big room.
May I add one more thing? If you want to try this, we have prepared some very, very simple pieces for you, where you only have to play the melody of the right hand. So don't be afraid.